Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 6th of June of 2026. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where during the previous 24 hours the Russians carried out another daily attack using hundreds of drones. As of the morning of the 6th of June of 2026, the Russians used 272 drones to attack the territory of Ukraine, but obviously the Russians didn't stop and continued attacking. According to information we have, as of the previous 24 hours, more than 400 drones recorded. The Russians were attacking mainly the southwestern parts of Ukraine, the southern parts of Ukraine, and so on. As for the Odesa region, the sources reported that the Russians used more than 45 drones to attack the region. Explosions were recorded through the city of Odesa, and the Russians were attacking ships and vessels that were either approaching the city of Odesa or was moving from the city of Odesa. At least two ships off the coast of Odesa have been attacked by drones. This was reported by pro-Ukrainian sources, and here we can see black smoke broke out right after the Russians attacked another vessel offshore the Odesa region. In this video, we can see how the Russians were using drones to attack Navy drones of the armed forces of Ukraine through the western parts of the Black Sea. Most likely, the Ukrainians were preparing to attack in the direction of the territory of the Russian Federation or in the direction of the Russian Navy fleet, but the Russians managed to discover these boats and to attack them. Another important situation is the territory between the settlement of Mayaki, Dniester River, and Romania. I would like to remind you that the most southwestern parts of Ukraine, we're talking about this part of the Odesa region, is one of the most important region of Ukraine, because this territory basically connects Ukraine with the NATO countries, especially with the country as Romania, and lots of supply goes right exactly through this territory. But the most important thing and the biggest problem for Ukraine, that these southwestern parts of Ukraine is connected with the mainland just through two bridges. The first bridge goes through the settlement of Zatoka along N33 road. This is the bridge. And the second bridge goes along the river of Dniester in the direction of the settlement of Mayaki, which means that if the Russians are able to destroy these two bridges, then the Ukrainians would be completely cut off Romania. So that is why the Ukrainians understand the situation, and we start receiving reports that the Ukrainians began building a lot of bridges along M15 road along the Dniester river with the purpose just to stay on the safe side. And during the previous 24 hours, an Iskander attack was recorded. The sources stated that the Russians attacked a bridge in this area. As you can see, we don't have this bridge on the map, but sources reported that the Ukrainians have created one, and the Russians, as we can see, destroyed the bridge with a missile attack. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kherson and the Zaporizhzhia regions. During the previous nights and during the previous 24 hours, the Russians destroyed a gas station between the cities of Nikolaev and Kherson. In this video, we can see the consequences of attack. We can see how fire teams were extinguishing the fire that in this area. Probably they managed to do this, but the thing is that this is not the first gas station that the Russians have destroyed since the beginning of this year. Probably the Russians have already destroyed dozens of gas stations, and the Russians continue this process. In the northern Kherson direction, the sources reported that the Russians destroyed several trucks that the Ukrainians were using for different purposes, and the Russians destroyed several pieces of engineering equipment. Another important thing is the Zelenodoysk power station. The Russians during the previous 24 hours attacked this territory using dozens of drones, and pro-Ukrainian sources published this video, and in this video we can see how the Russians were attacking the wall of this object of energy infrastructure with drones. As you can see, lots of attacks, lots of drones, and lots of explosions were recorded. This is a very interesting situation. Most likely the Russians will continue attacking the Zelenodoysk power station, and the Russians began attacking this power station due to the situation that is currently developing around the city of Energodar and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station. Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station completely without power. Backup diesel generators are in operation. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Rosatom reported, was completely without power due to the shutdown of the 330 power line which supplied the plant's internal power needs. So the Ukrainians began bombing and attacking the energy infrastructure of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, and we see that these attacks led right exactly to this situation. So that is why the Russians decided to mirror the situation, and the Russians began bombing and attacking the Zelenodolsk power station with the purpose to create the same situation. So this is the situation in this area. Obviously, the situation is critical, and we see that the Ukrainians probably will continue attacking the settlement of Energodar, and as we discussed during the previous videos, it seems that the Ukrainians are preparing something for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and for the summer military campaign. The Russians also attacked the Dnipro region. According to information we have, the Russians destroyed several truck parking sites in this area, and as you can see, several trucks were destroyed by Russians. As we discussed during the previous videos, currently the Russians are focused. They have their main focus, and currently the Russians, it seems that the Russians are tasked to destroy just 3 things on the territory of Ukraine. First of all, gas stations. The second one is logistic hubs, and the third one to destroy as many as possible trucks and parking sites with trucks and so on. So now the Russians, it seems, are focused just to destroy these 3 things, because we understand that these 3 things are the base of Ukraine's tactics to use hundreds of drones when attacking deep inside of the territory of Russia. And we see that despite the fact that since the beginning of this year, the Russians have destroyed dozens of gas stations, dozens probably of warehouses, and hundreds of trucks, we see that the level of drones that the Ukrainians use each day doesn't decrease. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation with Ukraine's attack. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians used around 1,000 of drones to attack deep inside of the territory of Russia, and during the previous day we received lots of updates on this matter. According to information we have, explosions were recorded on the territory of the settlement of Uzlovaya as of the evening of the 6th of June. It's very difficult to say what exactly the Ukrainians were attacking there. Furthermore, the Ukrainians attacked the Leningrad region, and we have a video published from this area. It seems that another object of energy infrastructure was significantly damaged by the Ukrainians with their attack of drones. Furthermore, lots of drones were recorded in the sky of the Leningrad region. Furthermore, the Ukrainians attacked objects of energy infrastructure in the southern parts of Russia on the territory of the settlement of Ust-Labinsk. In these videos, we can see fire that broke out right after the Ukrainians attacked the territory. So as you can see, the Ukrainians used thousands of drones, but we received just basically 4 or 5 videos from different parts of Russia. As for Ust-Labinsk, yes, there is a fire, but the situation is not critical. We have a video from Uzlovaya. The Ukrainians attacked some object, but the situation also is not critical. Probably the only result that the Ukrainians managed to achieve is the situation that is currently taking place in the Leningrad region. But the problem is that the Ukrainians, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, used around 1,000 of drones to attack during the previous night, and as a result of attack of these 1,000 of drones, we received just basically several videos that shows more or less a big result of the attack on the territory of the Leningrad region, which means that probably the effectiveness of these tactics is not so big, and it seems that the Russians probably are trying to stabilize the situation and to find a way how to stabilize the situation completely. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground during the previous 12 hours. So during the previous day, we received lots of very interesting updates. And first, let's talk about the Zaporizhzhia direction. According to very reliable pro-Russian sources, the armed force of the Russian Federation once again began an assault operation on the settlement of Mala Tokmachka. And during the previous day, first changes were recorded. As a result of clashes, the Russians, as you can see, improved their positions significantly through the central part part of the settlement, and the Russians finished the battle for the former prison in the southern parts of the city. It seems that the Russians began their major offensive operation in the direction of the city of Orekhov. Probably first the Russians are tasked to establish complete control over the settlement of Tokmachka, Novodanilovka, and then the Russians will finish the battle for the pocket between these two settlements, and then the Russians will continue offensive operation further in the direction of the city of Orekhov itself. At the same time, we receive reports that the Russians intensify their activities through the northern Orekhov direction between the settlements of Kopony, Dalinovka, Rovne, Lesnoye, and Lubitskaya. Today, the group of forces east issued a final warning and final ultimatum to the Ukrainians in this area. The Russians proposed the soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine in this area to surrender, or at least not to show any resistance to Russians. So the Russians issued a final ultimatum and final warning for this territory, which means that in coming days, the Russians most likely will intensify their offensive operation in this area with the purpose to establish complete control over these territories and to force the Ukrainians to fall back further in the western and the southwestern directions. If Russians are able to establish complete control over these territories to the north of the settlement of Orekhov, we're talking about this area, then this is going to be a very big problem for the contingent of the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of the city of Orekhov itself, because from these positions the Russians will continue advancing further in the western direction towards the settlement of Zhovta Kucha, and from the other side the Russians will increase pressure in the southern direction with the purpose to attack the settlement of Orekhov from behind. And as we discussed just a minute ago, at the same time the Russians intensify their activities from the southeastern part, from the southeastern direction of the city of Orekhov as well. So the Orekhov major battle, it seems, has begun. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kostyantynivka direction. One of the most important updates today we received exactly from this area. Today several pro-Russian sources reported that as a result of clashes the Russians have improved their position significantly in the central part of the city, and furthermore the Russian forces that were attacking through the eastern flank of the city of Kostyantynivka and the Russian forces that were attacking through the western flank of the city of Kostyantynivka managed to meet each other in the central part of the city along the Lutska Street. This information today was provided by pro-Russian sources, and according to these changes, the armed forces of Ukraine, the contingent of the armed forces of Ukraine, which is located between 81st, 92nd quarters and the Metallurg micro-district, were caught in Cauldron. As of now, we don't know for sure the exact number of the Ukrainians that were caught by the Russians in Cauldron. Maybe we're talking about 1,000, maybe we're talking just about several hundreds, but one thing is clear: it will be very difficult for these Ukrainians to break through the encirclement and to answer the northern part of the city. Furthermore, today we start receiving lots of updates that the Russians intensified their offensive operations significantly through the northwestern parts of the city, and the Russians right now are advancing along this line that I have just drawn on the map. The Russians are trying to take under complete control this part of the city, and of course, if it happens, most likely the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm complete control over the settlement. Another important thing that this day we see that the Russian offensive operation intensifies, and we see that now we start receiving more and more updates about changes on the ground through the city these days. Now the Russians are advancing much faster in comparison with previous months, with March or February of 2026. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation to the east of the city of Slaviansk. This day the Russians intensify their activities through the settlements of Nikolaevka and Alexandrovka. We haven't been receiving anything from this area for a very long period of time, but despite a complete absence of updates from this area, we see that the Russians use more and more drones, more and more aviation to bomb and attack positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. And these are the number of updates since the beginning of May of 2026 2026. And as you can see, the Russians are bombing the settlement of Nikolaevka significantly. Almost every single square kilometer have already been bombed by the Russians, and the Russians continue this process. Furthermore, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the western parts of the settlement of Alexandrovka, which means that the map shows more or less reliable positions of both the Russians and the Ukrainians. And as you can see, the Russians continue bombing the main logistic lines between three lines, between the main logistic roads, between defense, between strongholds of the armed forces of Ukraine in this area. Once again, despite the fact that we haven't received almost anything for a very long period of time, we believe that in coming days we should expect additional changes on the ground, probably about the situation in the settlement of Alexandrovka. As for the Liman direction, for the previous several months, we also haven't received almost anything from this area. The Russians, for some reason, stopped their offensive operation. The chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation reported that 2 or 3 weeks ago that the Russians already captured up to 85% of the settlement, but yet we haven't received anything that can confirm additional progress on the ground. The Russians stopped for some reason. Maybe the Russians right now are repelling the Ukrainian attacks. Right now, very difficult to understand, but we see that the Russians are about to finish the battle for the city of Kostyantynivka. The Russians are about to improve their position significantly to the east of the cities of Kramatorsk and Slaviansk, and all these updates, all these advances are very important, but the Russians will not be able to achieve maximum results without significant progress through the Liman direction. But for some reason, the Russians are not moving in this area, or at least we don't have anything, the pro-Russian sources don't publish anything about the situation in this direction. Now let's talk about the city of Kupyansk. During the previous and the Kupyansk direction, during the previous 24 hours, the map has been adjusted significantly. This is the situation by the end of the 8th of May. This is the situation by the end of the 6th of May of 2026. As you can see, we have colored completely the settlement of Podol in the southern parts of the city of Kupyansk, especially the Zaskolye micro-district, and we made these significant changes based on the video that was published by pro-Russian sources. In this video, we can see how Russian troopers were moving through this part of the settlement of Kupyansk. The author of this video reported that the Russians were patrolling the situation, trying to check whether the situation and the part of the city of Kupyansk is stable, whether there is no threat from the Ukrainian side, and so on. Lots of episodes we can see through this video, and at least 2 of them were geolocated. And based on these episodes, we have adjusted the map, and we see that despite claims from pro-Ukrainian sources, we see that the Ukrainians control less and less territories through the eastern bank of the river Oskol, and we see that the Russians are continue battle for this part of the Kupyansk foothold on the eastern part of the river, and it seems that the Russians in coming days will finish the battle for these territories, and the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from this area completely. So the battle for the Kupyansk continues, as we can see, but we see that the Ukrainians control less and less territories in this area. At the same time, the Russians intensify their offensive operation through the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region. The Russians entered the settlement of Losovka, and currently there are very heavy clashes for this village. And we see that the Russians continue their efforts to outflank the settlement of Bielye Kolodezh and to attack the stronghold from behind. We see that the Russians pay significant attention to this area, and we see that the Russians don't make any attempts to attack the settlement of Bielye Kolodezh from the north. And the thing is that the distance between the river of Volcha and the settlement of Bielye Kolodezh is around 10 kilometers, but these 10 kilometers have no fortifications and strongholds that the Russians may use to attack in the direction of the settlement, which means that if the Russians begin offensive operation from the north and the southern direction, then most likely the Russians would suffer more casualties and more losses. So that is why the Russians chose to outflank flank the settlement of Belgorod from the west and from the southwest. The clashes are taking place for the settlement of Losovka, which means that in coming days the Minister of Defense and the group of forces north may confirm Russian control over these territories and additional progress on the ground. And if Russians are able to break through Ukraine's defense like this, then the Ukrainians from the settlement of Belgorod could be caught by the Russians in Cauldron. Another important update, the Russians, according to sources, entered the settlement of Dniester. This was reported by the group of forces north. There are very heavy clashes on the territory of the village. And according to this report, in coming days, this village also could be captured by Russians, and we will receive additional report on this matter. So as you can see, as for the most northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, the clashes right now are taking place for the settlement of Losovka. The Russians started battle for the settlement of Dniester, and it's already 3 or 4 weeks past since the beginning of the battle for the village of Agrimovka. So 3 villages, which means that in coming days, one of these villages could be captured by Russians, and we will receive the report about this. So this is the situation about the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region. There are 3 settlements where the Russians are trying to break through Ukraine's defenses. As for the northern Kharkiv direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and the group of forces north reported that Russians, as a result of clashes, have captured the settlement of Shevchenka, which means that the Russians entered the settlement of Kazachia Lopany and the Russians continue advancing. This is a very interesting situation because we see, due to the fact that we have at least 4 places where the Russians are fighting along the border between Belgorod and Kharkiv regions. This means that the Russians are tasked most likely to continue advancing further in the direction of the city itself, and most likely will see the Kharkiv battle if the conflict on the territory of Ukraine doesn't end. Now let's talk about the Sumy direction. Here we have 2 places where the main clashes are taking place. The territory between the village of Pisarevka, Volzhanska and Novosich. We start receiving reports about battles in this area several probably weeks ago, or probably even months ago. Furthermore, the clashes are taking place for the settlement of Velika Rybitsa. Also, the Russians began advancing in the direction of the villages Veliki Priluki and Mala Rybitsa. As you can see, the Russians are trying to advance along the river of Rybitsa. Most likely, this means that the Russians would try to attack and to establish complete control over the territory to the east of this river. So this is the first task of Russians, and we start receiving first videos on this matter. The Russians began bombing and attacking positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. So the Sumy direction is also one of the most important directions for Russians for the summer military campaign and for the campaign of 2026. And the Russians continue offensive operation in the direction of Krasnopolye. Today, the group of forces north stated that the clashes right now are taken to the west of the railway station by the name of Petipilla. And the Russians continue advancing along the railways in the direction of the settlement of Krasnopolye. So this is the situation with the Sumy direction, and with the northwestern Sumy direction, we have reports that these days there are very heavy clashes on the territory of the settlement of Bachevsk. The battle for this village started probably 2 weeks ago, which means that in coming days the village may fall in Russia's hands. This is not the only direction where the clashes are taking place on the territory of the settlement. Furthermore, these days we start receiving updates that the clashes are also taking place on the territory of the settlement of Ulanova. And this battle also started somewhere a week ago or something like this, which means that in coming days the Russians may break through Ukraine's defense in the most northern parts of the Sumy region, which opens an operational space for the armed forces of the Russian Federation to continue offensive operation further in the direction of the settlement of Glukhov. And the settlement of Glukhov is a very big city, probably, that can allow the Russians to concentrate thousands of troops on the territory of this settlement, and then the Russians most likely will continue advancing further along MO2 road in the direction of the city of Kiev and the settlement of Konotop. So the battle in the northern Ukraine intensifies, and the situation here is quite difficult for the armed forces of Ukraine. And that's it for today. The Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye-bye.